Braidotti is saying we have the model of societies which are based on identities, and at the same time, those societies, because of that, partially, were also very sexist, xenophobic, and racist, and so on, and ethnocentric as well, and Europocentric, and anthropocentric, and so on. And look at the tribes or societies which are nomadic. What matters is how they cope with life at the moment, who is doing what. So these doings are also more important than who you are. You have a certain role at a certain point of time.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because it reminds me of bricolage theory, and where bricoleurs use their senses. Is this also an element of continuity?
As I mentioned before, that Braidotti is a representative of something we call difference feminism, or feminism of differences or difference, which is also called corporeal feminism, where the body and embodiment plays such a vital role. Actually, at the moment, we would rather call her that she's a new materialism feminist, right? And that she's already in that book in 90s, she's introducing the body and materiality as such an important part of being a person, a human being, doesn't matter the gender. And in the case of female bodies, it is especially important because, of course, there's a tradition of in feminism of dealing with different kind of experience connected with the bodies. Being mother is very material, very bodily experience because your body is changing in such a way that sometimes when we listen to female stories, they are not recognizing themselves. They don't know what's going on. Some of them are happy, some are very unhappy, and so on. And she says that, and I think there is a kind of memory in our body which is beyond our conscious thought, and introducing something which is out of reflection or out of reasoning into philosophy is very revolutionary thing. Because according to the philosophical tradition, the nature of human is in rationality, in reflective thought, and so on. And now she's saying, no, a part of our identity is also the body. But of course, sometimes it is really difficult to explain why do you feel such and such thing, because maybe you don't remember something from your childhood and it's still there in your body. So when you ask about embodiment, of course she's approaching it in a very different way from different angles, but that's something which matters a lot, including very controversial thing about her feminist thought of that time. I'm not sure about nowadays, so let me just speak about the time when she was publishing the nomadic subjects. For example, she says that men cannot be feminists.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, can you elaborate?
Yeah, and it's always because I disagree with her at that point. But she is proposing certain argumentation which can be convincing. She says, when you're coming from the group which is marginalized and discriminated, you should have the experience of being such. And not having female body, you will never understand what does it mean to be discriminated because of being female. And that's why men, of course they can be in favor of feminism, but in a very strict sense they will never be feminists.
But it's like saying that doctor who didn't experience the specific symptoms cannot cure them. Or I can see why it can be controversial.
Yeah, it is controversial because it says you cannot really say real stuff about having children when you do not have children yourself. And I disagree with that. I mean, you can absolutely say something about having children and this experience, not having it experience yourself, but it will be just different story.
Exactly. Or you can experience it with like someone else's children.
Absolutely. But coming back to your question, it's about embodiment. She says that body is such a vital part of your identity that if your body is female and not male, and otherwise vice versa, you cannot have and share the same experience. That's why in that book she was against that idea that men can be feminists, and it was also connected with certain social or even scientific research movement at the universities she was observing at the USA, where there was a proliferation of gender studies in the USA. There were more and more male professors who wanted to do gender studies.
Yeah, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
We know.
And she was, she was very much against it. That again, somebody else will be speaking on behalf of women, being male.
Yeah. So we know that also. When you see consultation, for example, in Poland, politicians who were debating and deciding on reproductive rights act and changes to legislation, and women were not represented in such a form on numbers as we wished. That's always the same old story. So from that perspective, I understand where she's coming from.
She's touching something really vital and very important. She was quite radical about it at that time. I don't really know what would she say today.
So that's very interesting. So thank you for sharing this. I specifically was interested in that book because some people view that as the beginning of posthumanism in her views, even if she's not like mentioning posthumanists in that book yet. So how do you view that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't really remember some such details if she was mentioning the very word posthumanist or posthumanism. I don't remember that. But for sure there were chapters when she was saying that when we talk about nomadic subjectivity, we're also talking about very particular moment of our culture and time where human beings are in kind of transformation, in such a sense that we are becoming more like animals. And she means that after Darwin we discovered that we are animals, so we should not be treated as the kings and queens of the whole nature, and rather really see us as a part, and maybe very small part of nature. And on the other hand, she was also talking a lot about technology. Although we were not yet approaching communication technologies then at that point, but she was really very right about it, that human identity, human nature, as philosophers would like to say, will change because we will be transforming into something else because of those technologies we are using. It will be part of us. So she was really close to the idea of cyborg, of Donna Haraway book, and they were sharing some stuff. But you were mentioning reproductive rights. She was also talking about reproductive rights in the context of technologies and trying to interpret the consequences of applying such technologies. Are we able to produce children without natural resources but just using technologies? Is it something which will be possible in the future or not? So that means that we have to stop thinking about humans as the center of our reflection, philosophical reflection, which is already post-humanistic. Because humanism and anthropocentrism was always about human beings being in the center and as a point of reference for everything. And she's trying to go away with that already in that book. And I think she's very right, especially in her reflection on how we relate to animals. Animals mean food, animals mean benefits for big companies, animals mean pets, for example, how differently we approach something we call nature. So it's already there, and it's a part of the tradition of post-humanist thought.
Which is on the rise in a way, like when it comes to research, so contemporary research.
Sure.
So my next question is, what do you think posthumanist approach, what does it require from researchers, contemporary research in general, and what kind of opportunities it creates for researchers?
The second part maybe is easier to answer for me, because in the context of climate change catastrophe, when we realize how we are responsible for that, and especially how capitalism is responsible for that, because not every human being is personally responsible of what's going on, we somehow are obliged, I think, in philosophy to try to develop the theory where the happiness, well-being of human being is not analyzed in such a way that we are not taking into account anything else. Because so far it was something like that we didn't count nature on the one side, but also other beings than Western, white, rich people, and there's a lot of literature about it. But at the same time, I would say it's easier to do in sociology, for example, cultural studies maybe. But in philosophy, the language is so much in tradition of speaking about human beings and nature of humans that it's difficult to go away. And there are certain trials, and I think Rosi Braidotti is one of them. But there's also, as I mentioned, Donna Haraway, who's using the cyborg metaphor and also dog metaphor. There's a Tsing, for example, who's using mushrooms, that she says the main idea, we should think about identities as in the mushrooms. So she's taking certain example from the nature and is concentrating on it in her philosophical thinking, which already sounds a little bizarre.
I didn't know what you wanted to say about mushrooms.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. It was actually translated into Polish also at my university, and it's really interesting how she is. Examples are really difficult for philosophers, but let's try. We can ask the question, what's the nature of relationship between human beings and other beings? And you can start from yourself. And then it's really anthropocentric, it's not posthumanistic. Right. And she is proposing, well, look how mushrooms live, how they are making the relationships with other stuff.
So because underneath they are all connected.
And they are connected, and they are kind of symbiotic relationship with trees and with something else and so on. So maybe we should base our relationships with surroundings in such a way with other humans, but not only humans and non-human beings. That's kind of proposal which are people trying to develop when you ask about post-humanist view. There are a lot of proposals. Of course, I've mentioned just few, but they are difficult. They are difficult because I think in practice, in capitalist practice, we're still very anthropocentric.
So, interdisciplinary studies. Should we be like researchers? Should we be like mushrooms somehow connected, or trying to build or uncover that connection between disciplines, between concepts, instead of I don't know, just generating more mushroom caps, which are like, you know, artificially produced. Probably also connected, I'm not sure, but something that could be more organic, and as a result, maybe, I don't know, less publications, but more valuable works.
For sure, the research and science, or something I would rather call today technoscience, is something, it's a different topic in a way, but I would agree that first argument in favor of transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary study is that the world is so complex that no one discipline is able to catch it, actually. So we really need that cooperation, and when you will provide the aim of how we scientists and researchers can help to stop the climate catastrophe, or to stop the proliferating of violence in several countries across the globe, and proliferation of people living in poverty and so on. But we should really cooperate, not just concentrate on the problems of very rich Western countries. And you need a lot of disciplines for that, but you also need the diversity among scientists. And we do not have it, because when you look at techno-scientific studies which also analyze what is the profile of average scientists, it's rather white or Asiatic person using English language and coming from European culture or alias European culture, so something which again is showing just one part of the problems of the contemporary world. So that's why not only interdisciplinarity is such an important part, because it gives us a lot of cognitive benefits, but also from ethical point of view. It should be more diverse, and we know from the studies that we do not need only natural sciences or sciences which are technically oriented. We also need social studies and humanities, and we should cooperate all together. But for that, we really need a different system of science, not based on capitalist structure.
Absolutely. And there are also like different, there's a need for, I guess, different methods as well. Like for example, affective ethnography, where you approach the methods needs to change as well in order to access knowledge that is otherwise not accessible.
It's not, and also for that you really need to change the system structurally, because for example affectivity then has to be recognized as a valuable resource for cognition, and it is not. I mean, it used to be not really neglected in philosophical thinking, that affectivity is something which actually interfere with your rational thought and reflection. Nowadays we know it's not true. After embodiment movement, not only in philosophy but also in cognitive science and sociology, we know how affection and affective relationship is important for cognitive reasons as well. But again, when you introduce it to a certain discipline, it's not so easy because it's so revolutionary to do that.
So maybe philosophy is like that mushroom base. I don't know how it's the proper term for mushrooms connecting underneath, but maybe because philosophy, all the disciplines came from philosophy, so
historically speaking, you can say that.
So maybe it's not a coincidence that I'm interviewing you, a philosopher. I wanted to ask work-life balance. Bricolage, they are very good in blurring boundaries, which is not very good for them when it comes to work-life balance. So what about philosophers? Do you rest from philosophy? You are on holidays right now, so what we are talking about.
It's so different in many different philosophical stories. So I will start from Ludwig Wittgenstein, a very famous Austrian philosopher. I was devoting my PhD to his later views, and he was known for saying that when you are becoming philosopher, you will always be unhappy. Because
makes sense.
You will constantly be thinking about something, and even very simple daily things will be complex for you, and you will be also analyzing every word and meanings of the word, and it will be time consuming and energy consuming. Exactly. But I disagree with him in such a sense that I really believe that you can be philosopher not in only professional way, but it's also a kind of way of living for you. Wittgenstein would call it form of life. But it doesn't make me unhappy. It's sometimes I do, because I think too much. My father used to say, okay, you think too much, you should do something and feel something, do not think so much. And he was right, probably. But it doesn't make you unhappy, it makes you curious and also annoying in a sense. I think philosophers can be annoying because they disagree
for
with
themselves
you.
or for others?
For others. Because as a philosopher of science, when I speak to scientists, I was working on genetics a lot, so I was speaking also with people doing biology. They were really nice, open people, but they were still saying, okay, but why are you criticizing those methods? We know they have certain limits, but we are still using them, and so on. And I was just always saying, okay, maybe we should find something else, and they were not interested because they were interested in the aim. But I think
results.
Yeah, and results, and that's what you were also mentioning, right? That maybe we should stop thinking while doing research on the results so much. But of course, it is easy to say. But when you look at the system of financing science, you have to really plan a lot in order to get any scholarships or grants. They already say, oh, give us the aims, the goals, and how you will achieve them, and then we will maybe give you some money for that. And Einstein was always saying, if I knew what I'm going to discover, it would not be science. I mean, I didn't know.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you have the self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's that makes sense. What have you read recently that was not philosophy related to philosophy?
I actually have this rule. Maybe that's that technical kind of bricolage. I have this rule that in the evening before I go to sleep, I never read philosophy. I always read something else. At the moment, I read a biography of Sylvia Plath again, because I really like her poetry. So I used to read a lot of her biographies, and nowadays one of the recent one was translated into Polish, so I read it in Polish.
All right. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
For your time, and it was just amazing. And also, like on Monday when we were having you presenting for us. So here at Macquarie.
Thank you, Lisa. I feel privileged that you thought that there will be, and your questions were great, and I was having a really
and I learned a lot.
Yeah. And stress disappeared. It was just a joy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Wyjdzie. I zawsze, ale to Foucault tak kiedyś powiedział, że on powiedział, że to nie człowiek rządzi językiem, tylko język rządzi człowiekiem. Czyli, że ty do końca, bo jest jakaś twoja rola w tej twórczości, ale częściowo to też to język coś ci tam wkłada. Teraz jeszcze masz AI, albo jeśli jeszcze używasz jakichś metod takich naukowych, które są po prostu pewnym rodzajem robienia czegoś i przez przypadek, tak jak ty mówisz nawet, weźmiesz jedną rzecz inaczej i się nagle okaże, że coś niezwykłego odkrywasz. Ale to nie jest coś, co da się przewidzieć i w tym sensie to będzie zawsze taka, się zastanawiam, czy ten bricolage to zawsze taka metoda, że ona mówi, że możesz różne, czy ona na przykład w takim zastosowaniu, jak ty powiedziałaś, tam w tej przedsiębiorczości, tak? Czy ona już jest taka skonkretyzowana, że musisz to dokładnie i to wziąć? Czy tam jest jakieś miejsce na takie, nie wiem, kojarzy mi się to, nie wiem, z takim doświadczeniem, jakim miałam. Mój taki przyjaciel swego czasu jako copywriter pracował w takiej wielkiej amerykańskiej firmie i pamiętam, że go odwiedziłam w tej firmie, to było wiele lat temu i to w Polsce jeszcze nie było popularne, bo w Polsce było popularne, że przychodzisz od do pracy, i coś robisz, nie? I ja tam przychodziłam do niego i oni mieli taki wielki, taką przestrzeń jak tutaj, tylko taką bardzo zieloną i tak dalej. Oni leżeli na ziemi i tak sobie coś tam patrzyli w obłoki. Ja mówię, a co to tutaj jest? A mówię, no to są copywriterzy, którzy pracują.
Aha.
No i to jest ostatnia rzecz, którą byś powiedziała o nich, że oni tam gdzieś pracują, nie? Ale chodziło o to, że oni potrzebowali takiej przestrzeni, w której nikt im nie narzuca niczego. Ani kierunku myślenia, ani niczego i wtedy ponoć im wychodziły najfajniejsze pomysły na te reklamy. Oczywiście jakby cel nie jest wspaniały, no po prostu reklamowali coś dla kogoś, kto musiał zarobić więcej pieniędzy, ale chodzi mi o samą metodę,
no tak.
Że oni nie kazali im siadać koło stołu i teraz macie takie hasło i musicie je obrobić, tylko oni po prostu tak się tam gdzieś...
I było kreatywnie.
Tak, no bo coś w tym jest, nie? Że ta kreatywność, bo to jest tym, co Einstein powiedział, no gdyby Einstein dzisiaj musiał napisać jakiś grant, tylko nigdy nie dostał, no bo on nie przewidział tych wyników, nie? On powiedział, że on ich nie przewidział, że one takie będą.
O Boże!
No nie dostałby jak nic. you.